I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 108. And this week it is Terri's turn to share what I think is probably going to be the last chapter from Brené Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart. I think we're going to come back next week with a wrap-up of the book episode. But this is the last week for you to share a chapter, Terri. So where are you going to go this week? I think it was heading back into a bit of doom and gloom, wasn't it?
It is a bit, Daisy. And I'm kind of laughing because I'm looking at the chapters in the book right now on my phone. And I feel like somehow when we started going every other chapter, I'm getting the long ones and you're getting the short ones. Because this one was a doozy. It was a 43-minute chapter on Audible. And a heavy one that you and I have had a difficult time even getting together to record. So it's made it even feel heavier. Yeah. But this one is chapter 12, Places We Go When We Feel Wronged. Anger, contempt, disgust, dehumanization, hate, and self-righteousness. Dun, dun, dun. So what I tried to do in jotting down some notes as I was listening to this is just pick up some of the main points, because I really think any one of these emotions we could spend quite a bit of time on, and tried to make it so that we could get through an episode and get to have some discussion about it.
It was quite weighted, to be fair. I mean, she waited a lot more time on the first couple, really, I think, didn't she?
Absolutely. So anger being the first one, and a couple of the key points that she made about anger that I really latched onto is the idea that anger is an action emotion. And I think it's one of those examples where many of us learn anger is not an okay emotion. We learn that it's dangerous to express. We get in trouble if we express it. We were taught as kids not to express it. Or we experience that it's dangerous or bad when other people express it. So I think for many people, anger is a complicated emotion. And she talked about the fact that it really can vary in intensity, all the way from mild irritation to fury. So it's a pretty broad emotional description. And in general, where it comes from is when we believe something has gotten in the way of a desired outcome, or something wrong has happened. Oftentimes we have an external source for this, that someone else or something else is responsible. Although I would say quite often I hear people struggling with getting angry with themselves, which I don't think she covered as much. In some of the research focusing on anger, one of the things I thought was interesting is the idea that it causes all kinds of problems for us health-wise and for our brain even. And so regulating anger and coping with anger is actually essential to help mitigate these negative effects and to help with brain health. And again, so many of us have learned just to suppress it. And I think it's really important for people to recognize that's not our best strategy. So we've got to learn how to regulate and learn how to cope with it.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting. She called it a full contact emotion. What you were saying there about it taking a toll on your emotional health. And she was saying that it activates our nervous system and can hijack our thoughts and behaviours. And I think I joke sometimes about that made me feel rageful, but we're all very familiar with that sort of, people call it different things, but they're like the red mist descends, and it does feel kind of like it overtakes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like your hair's on fire.
Yeah.
One of the things that she talked about that I was happy to hear her talk about, but it defied my way of talking about it for so many years as a therapist. So like Brené Brown, I really had to reconsider my way of thinking about this. But there's often a little bit of a controversy whether anger is one of our primary emotions.
Yes, I thought that discussion was really interesting. Yeah.
And I think she did a nice job of recognizing or highlighting the idea that maybe it's how we define primary or not primary. But I have often been a therapist when I would work with people who were experiencing anger or struggling with anger. I would often have them look at the other emotions, because I did fall under that school of thought that said that anger was not one of the primary emotions, that it was secondary to emotion or other emotions that are either more difficult to acknowledge, are harder to identify, or just for some reason, anger almost is easier. So, for example, I often would talk about feeling hurt makes us feel vulnerable, makes us feel open to more hurt. But feeling angry makes us feel more defended. And the listeners can't see, but I'm holding up my fist right now in front of me. So anger, in the way I always thought about it, protected us from some of those more vulnerable feeling states. But in some research where they had people identify their emotions, it came to the surface that within that research, about 91% did identify anger as a primary emotion. So it kind of defied, I think Brené Brown acknowledged she used to think of it as a secondary emotion. But in how you might help someone looking at their anger, you might, as a therapist or someone, you might kind of walk them through behind this anger. What are the other feelings? I feel betrayed. I feel hurt, disrespected, that it's not just the anger. There are usually kind of a cohort of other emotions behind it, that if you can acknowledge those and work through those, you can then take action with the anger rather than kind of getting stuck with it.
Exactly. I kind of found when she was talking about that, when I first started writing some notes on that, I'd written it down as she was saying, yeah, she thought of it as a secondary emotion, and that, maybe she was wrong and it was primary, and this whole debate about what's primary and secondary. But then when she went on to talk all around it, what I took away from it was that she still kind of really came down on the side of it being secondary, and that sort of these top three emotions that were identified, happy, sad, mad. What I kind of got out from this was just its limited vocabulary, and using anger, defining the emotion as anger, was kind of sloppy in a way. It's just too simple language. We're using anger to define, as you were saying, this whole range of emotions. And it seemed to me that what she still came down on the side of thinking that really it was just an umbrella term that was masking all these other things. And actually you really need to dig in and identify what the actual emotions are behind that thing you're defining as anger.
Which also I think is helpful, going back to her other point about it being kind of an action emotion, that recognizing all of these other pieces of it, the anger is what can drive us to action, to act on those.
And I guess it's the kind of the surface level of what's simmering underneath.
Mm-hmm. She talked about, as she does in many of these chapters and many of her talks about social justice throughout. And she talked about anger in social justice issues, oftentimes, that we're kind of, from a passive aggressive message from other people, told that we should stop showing our feelings because they're uncomfortable with them. And I think this really comes out often in issues of sexism, racism, homophobia. When someone expresses their anger based on being discriminated against or being in one of these groups, that they're often told by the other group, oh, please stop sharing that. That's making me uncomfortable. Clearly, that's just your issue.
Yeah, you're so angry.
Yeah. As if you have no right to be.
Yeah.
You should just tolerate what I'm handing you here. She then talked about holding our anger is not sustainable long term. It makes us exhausted and sick. And I think that's an important thing to remind ourselves. Some people internalize it, turn it inward on themselves, and it really then tends to take away joy and, diminishes our spirit. And if we externalize anger, if we're throwing it out there to other people and acting on it all the time, it makes us less effective in creating change or in connecting with others. She then said something that I really liked, and this was a quote. She basically said, anger is a powerful catalyst. It is what pushes us toward change, but it is not change itself. But this was the quote that I really liked. Anger is a powerful catalyst, but a life-sucking companion. So holding on to it, it's like holding on to misery, but acknowledging it and letting it be a catalyst to change, that's the power of it.
It's like the hot potato, isn't it? You sort of got it and you've got to do something with it. It is a catalyst for change. It is something you can actually sometimes do something really good with it, but you can't hold on to it for long. It was this very much, you kind of sometimes got this opportunity with anger to turn it into something productive, but you've kind of got to be quick about it and release it and throw it out there in, I guess, kind of repackage it and throw it out there in something that's more productive.
And look at it as far as what does it drive me toward? What change is needed here? She also used another phrase for it that I really liked. She said it's a very effective emotional indicator. And I think she used an analogy like an indicator light in your car.
That's right. Yeah.
That lets you know, oh, the oil is low or the brake fluid is getting low or something, that if you can pay attention to your anger, it may help indicate those other things that are going on. Like, oh, I felt disrespected in that example. Let me go work on how to establish respect with that person or whatever it is. My biggest takeaway from the anger was the idea of not holding on to it, learning how to use it as a catalyst, and allowing it to be that emotional indicator, paying attention when you're angry. What is it really telling you? To make it more productive rather than just a life-sucking companion, as she said.
And that you can transform it into something else. You started this discussion off with saying it's something we've been taught that we're not supposed to express, and it's dangerous when other people express it, but not necessarily always.
So the next one that she describes is contempt. And you and I just realized in our notes, neither of us really captured her definition of contempt, but a lot of notes about contempt. And one of the things I enjoyed about this part of this chapter is she made references to the Gottmans. And when I was a psychologist, I loved the Gottmans' work. I did their continuing education. I read their books. I talked about it all the time with clients. And they are probably the most well-known couples therapists in the United States, at least. John Gottman describes contempt as perhaps the most corrosive force in marriage, that if you have the anger has gotten to this place of contempt, it's very hard to backtrack. It's very hard to go back and repair. So knowing when you get to the place of contempt, you've got an even more serious issue going on. One of the things about the Gottmans that's really quite fascinating is they do a ton of research, or have done a ton of research in watching couples interact and things. And they have a very high predictive ability in watching a couple and predicting whether they will divorce or stay together. They describe that contemptuous communication is most predictive of divorce. So it's the most harmful piece of what they then refer to as the 4 horsemen. And these are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt, with really contempt being the most problematic. I'm not going to go through all of those, but if you're interested, the Gottmans' work, any of their books on relationships and marriage are great books in learning these strategies or these concepts. But Brené Brown talked a little bit about the difference between criticism and contempt is that in contempt, The intent is to insult psychologically or to abuse the partner. It's not just saying something that's critical of the other person, but it is really intended to cut deep.
Get the knife in, yeah.
Which, if you go back then to what the Gottman said, yeah, no wonder it is perhaps the most corrosive force in marriage. Contempt is poisonous to any relationship. Basically, it's saying, I am better than you and you are less than me. And it's obviously problematic for both sides, the receiver of the contempt as well as the person conveying the contempt. Even the person conveying the contempt, the contemptuous person, is very likely to experience low self-esteem. And they talked about how this even kind of comes together, feeling bad about myself. I need to attack you and put myself as better than you to somehow try to elevate myself, but it doesn't work that way. One of the things she then said is that we see this happen in a lot of situations, and a number of things that you and I are going to talk in a few minutes are very easy to see in a lot of political discussions and things. But this part, for me, it made sense as I was listening. I hope I can make sense of it here. But one of the things she identified, which I had never heard this phrase before, is motive attribution asymmetry, where basically you think you attribute the other person's motive to be hatred and that they are evil, whereas assuming or attributing your own drive to goodness and benevolence, and that this is really incorrect. But I feel it, and I know I get limited in my thoughts this way around political issues. I think people who vote this way, we are benevolent and good and trying to help. And people who vote this way or who think this way are evil and trying to create hatred. And at this time, as I was listening to this chapter, and I don't know if you experienced this, but I've listened to this chapter about 3 times in the past week, and it's a pretty volatile time politically in the US and things. So these concepts all felt very current to me.
Yeah, and the word that comes up is polarizing. And it really does just create more and more distance. They're basically an enemy with whom one cannot negotiate or compromise. So there's no point discussing it.
And contempt makes us less happy. As you said, it makes political compromise and progress impossible, creates an impasse, and oftentimes really leads to the conviction of the worthlessness of the other. So why even discuss? Why bother? Because they are worthless. And, you can see this all over social media. It also stimulates cortisol and adrenaline. So again, it has physiological responses for us. Moving on from that heavy emotion, kind of going into some others that I think are still related. She talked about disgust. And she talked about it first in reference to food, finding something distasteful, disgust. It's gross, basically. As I was listening to her, just started to think about this, that many of us learn this as far as kind of physical contamination, that something is disgusting. And she talked about a scale of disgust, and it would ask you things like, I would eat monkey meat on occasion. And, to what degree would you do this? Or how disgusting would you think that is? This idea that when many of us think of disgust, we think of that kind of contamination or grossness. And then this spills over in how we talk about other people. So again, the polarizing around a political issue or a social issue, that the people who think this are disgusting to us. And
it's tapping into that evolutionary, life-saving reaction.
Because if I hold them in disgust, I will protect myself from being contaminated by them. And it's not, in this case, then it's not physically contaminated by the infectious nature of the food, but I'll protect myself from being infected by their nature of thought or behavior. So again, couldn't be a bigger week where this just felt really well exemplified of what's going on.
Yeah. I guess that's where the whole the different toxic culture buzzwords come up, it's the same thing. It's tapping into that disgust, isn't it? It's difficult, isn't it, that what we've just been talking about, this contempt and disgust, and how it's so polarizing. But actually the solution, what's the solution, is to get over that and to actually talk about the things. I think I wrote down here, the solution is not to disagree less, but to disagree without contempt or cruelty. It's that whole having a debate. You can debate things as much as you like without getting personal about it.
That's right.
But it's a difficult line not to cross sometimes, isn't it?
And I think when it comes to the whole disgust issue, she mentioned something about it, again, on a continuum from mild dislike to actually feeling repulsed by. And how many times in our conversations, just you and I, have we talked about being repulsed by certain ways of approaching topics and, social justice issues and things. It's interesting to me, if I sit back and look at it, how quickly I fall into these ways of thinking. She then talked some about dehumanization, and I did not take many notes of this because it seems like maybe it wasn't as big, but I know this is a topic that she talks about often. But I wrote down just the idea that to dehumanize people, and we've seen this throughout history and we see it now, is many of us, we experience a bit of a conflict between wanting to hurt someone while still holding the value that it's not right to harm another human being. And that's a complicated conflict within us. And so dehumanization means I can make them not human-like so that my desire to hurt them and my hatred toward them does not cause conflict in that value in me. We talk about people as rats, as pigs, as things that aren't human, so that our hatred or our want to hurt them or remove their rights or whatever doesn't conflict with that treating humans the way they should be treated. It allows us to separate them out as not human. And obviously we see this in social justice issues, in racism, in homophobia, misogyny, all kinds of things, to dehumanize one group from another.
Well, that's what's so frightening, I think. And I didn't write many notes on this either, but in some ways I don't think it needs them. And it's just down in one corner of the page, but they're all linked. It's the disgust and this physical reaction, but then the dehumanization, got a big circle around it, but going from disgust, it's the weaponization of disgust that leads to the dehumanization. And how do you do that? You do that with language. I mean, she always talks about, doesn't she, how language is important. The words we use are important. The words, and then it goes on to images. And yeah, we've seen this over and over again in history. And it produces a feeling of disgust in me. And this is the importance of language. And I remember, and I meant to look up her name, and perhaps it's best that I don't mention her name. Katie somebody or other was a journalist, and bearing in mind this came out in a national tabloid. This was printed. Someone allowed this to go to print, and she was describing the asylum seekers coming across the channel in their flimsy boats, and she referred to them as cockroaches. And then went on in the article to talk about how we should be basically pushing them back with warships, how you can go from one thing to another, like you say, with this dehumanization. You dehumanize them. If somebody is less than human and you start talking about them as a them, and the less you can think of them as being human beings. But I found that disgusting. How it was disgusting that she wrote it, but how was that allowed to be published? How can you refer to desperate human beings as cockroaches? But yet she did.
Yeah.
And, and that gets into the psyche. And that is the kind of thing that ends up dehumanizing these people. And I hear these conversations all the time. And these desperate people that are coming across in this way and risking their lives, and the way they are referred to, and the way they're discussed as this group of them who are less than human.
And as you said, how could it be allowed? It, happens, I think, all the time, in that by it being allowed, it shows not necessarily groupthink completely, but the idea that it's allowed because it's a common way to think of them. And that newspaper or that magazine or, whatever, that business didn't disagree with it, didn't stop it because they share that belief at some level. And then this turns into the hate. And when Brené Brown talked about hate, she said, hate is aimed to harm or destroy the target. And understanding from another's point of view is one antidote to hate. That if we can work on understanding their way of seeing it, how they have that belief and how that serves them or what that means for them, that is one possible antidote to hate. And I remember that when I was in grad school and I took a course on lesbian, gay, and bisexual issues. And we talked a lot about that. People start to have less hate and discriminate less when they have to start looking at it from the point of view of someone they love. So, if you have a brother or a sister or a parent who is lesbian or gay or bisexual, it's a little harder to hate that group because you start seeing it from the point of view of someone you love.
And having that conversation with somebody, I think she made the observation that it's often something that's at a distance. If you actually can have these conversations with people, even if you go into it thinking, you've got these really opposing views, if you can actually get people together talking about it.
Also why it's easier to do that on social media, behind your laptop screen,
exactly.
Instead of face-to-face and actually having dialogue. And then, last but not least, at the end of this, she started talking about self-righteousness.
Oh, this was a funny one.
And I think I told you this the other day when we were trying to record this and didn't get a chance to, and then needed to come back to it. This was probably one out of this whole book that I actually had a response to, because I recognize when I do it and I don't like feeling it. I know Brené Brown talked about that, about a number of these things, but dang it, this one really got to me. So you kind of chuckled when I first brought up this topic, and I know she gave some really powerful references here that we're both kind of smiling about, but this one is one for me. It's judgments against others to hide the noise of the skeletons dancing in our own closets. Like, oh, yes. Yeah, I guess I'm not quite so perfect, but I'd like to pretend that I'm right and always on the right side of issues and things. And so that self-righteousness is something that I don't really appreciate in myself, but recognize as I was listening to her describe this. Self-righteousness really is kind of the conviction that one's beliefs or behaviors are the most correct. Feeling morally superior and trying to convince ourselves that we are doing the right thing. And I'm still cringing even as I say these, because I don't want to be in that role or in that mode of being self-righteous. And yet I catch myself doing it. And I know you like another phrase in there that she said. Several of them I think you talked about.
Oh, yeah. Well, it cracked me up. She was talking about her in one of her AA meetings, and somebody else was describing self-righteousness, and they described it as that sort of delicious feeling of a pig rolling around in shit. And she was, oh, yes, that's me. And she recognized herself. And I was thinking about this again earlier, of that. There is a kind of delicious feeling as you're rolling around in it. But of course you stand up and you're covered in it, aren't you? you kind of got to wash it off at some point. So it is almost as a sort of tantalizing feeling to be in, but it's not nice at the same time when you recognize it, when you look in the mirror and see yourself covered in it.
Absolutely. And I think in line with that, she also used a phrase that I'd never really heard used before: terminal uniqueness.
Yeah.
that belief that you are different than everyone else to such a degree.
You are the exception.
Yes. Yeah. This is not good. But when I do it, it's because of this. Then it's okay. So I think I'm squinting even as I talk about this last part of the chapter, not because the other parts weren't also heavy and I recognize when I do those things, but these clearly make me feel really uncomfortable with my behavior when I come from a place of self-righteousness, thinking, clearly I have the best intention when I do this and it's fine when I do it and I am most correct. Well,
of course, because she compares, of course, it to righteousness. Mm-hmm. You know, and righteousness is appropriately reacting to a true injustice and trying to do the right thing. So I think with self-righteousness, you're kind of sort of trying to convince yourself that you're being righteous rather than self-righteous. Mm-hmm. And she talks about the thing that gets to her most is performative moral outrage. Mm-hmm. That's for her is the epitome of self-righteousness.
Absolutely.
There was a kind of bit of a word of warning there with self-righteousness, and I can see how easily it can happen, and it's probably indicative of that kind of flip side and the kind of person who might potentially fall into self-righteousness. But she says, I'm better than can slip so easily and quickly into I'm worthless. Mm-hmm. So it just goes to show how fragile you can be when you're having feelings like that.
And you certainly know from all conversations we've had, Daisy, that's never a place I go with this. But that's right. The extreme dichotomy, it doesn't even make sense if you think about it. I think I'm so right. I think I'm, so high and mighty in ways, and then I'm totally worthless. Of course, I don't know anything. It's a complicated mind that we have at times. So as you said earlier, Daisy, we're going to do kind of a wrap up, but I've been listening to some people in the fasting method community and some other places making reference to this book as you and I have been talking about it. And I've heard a couple people say, I'm going to have to read this book more than once. It's just so rich with so much to reflect upon, to understand about ourselves and others better. And this chapter was a bit of a doozy for me in those ways.
Yes, although it sounded a bit doom and gloom when we started with the list of emotions, it is a really rich chapter. I think it's definitely worthwhile. We've both listened to it several times over. But yes, we are coming to an end. And as we said at the beginning, we will be back for a wrap-up week next week. So until that time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, Daisy, and everyone out there.